GPS, one of the biggest mysteries in this crisis is, how did the virus make the leap to humans? Many fingers point to China at its wet markets in Wuhan. But what about the virology lab a few miles away? I will get the latest science from one of the world's foremost virus hunters when we get back. So where did the novel coronavirus come from? That is the million-dollar question that scientists around the world are trying to answer, including my next guest, Peter Daszak. He is one of the world's foremost virus hunters, tracking down different strains of viruses in their main host animal often, the bat. Peter, thanks for joining me. Let me ask you to begin by telling us, how do you do what you do? How do you figure out where a virus comes from?
Well, first of all, we look at the past history of pandemics and look at where they originated, and we do a lot of sort of analyses of that and say, what are the underlying drivers? And we go to those places on the planet and we look at wildlife, because almost all pandemics originate in animals, usually wildlife, often bats. And then we go out and we catch those animals and we sample them and we look for viruses, and we try and work out of the viruses we find which could be the next pandemic and which are safe, and then try and reduce the risk of those emerging. How do
you figure out? I guess physically, you go into bat caves and get get blood from bats.
Well, we go into bat caves. We wear full PPE, mask, gloves, suits to protect ourselves from getting infected, just to even go in a cave. And then as it goes towards dusk, we set mist nets up outside the cave, we catch the bats, and then we sample them, and we take blood samples, salival swabs, fecal samples, and we look for viruses in those in the lab. We look for the genetic sequences of the viruses.
So with this one, there seems to be a broad consensus that it came from a bat, probably a bat in Wuhan. And the controversy is, did it come from a bat in the Wuhan wet market or from a bat in the level 4 lab that is a few miles away? Is there any sense you have as to which is more likely?
I think the question is right. What we've got to do, it may be that we'll never really know the answers to where this virus actually originated. But what you've got to do is look at this in a balance of probabilities. Our work shows that people in Southeast Asia are exposed to these viruses every single day, every single year. We predict between 1 and 7 million people a year actually get infected by these bat coronaviruses. And it's only occasionally that unlucky person happens to go to a market, or the animal infects someone in a wildlife market, and then the virus can spread and become pandemic. We think that probably these viruses originate in southwest China or even bordering countries, and we've found hundreds of bat coronaviruses in those regions, and people there have an intimate connection with wildlife, including hunting and eating them.
You know the head of that level 4 virology lab, Xizhen Li. Do you think that she is being entirely honest when she says confidently and with certitude that the virus was not from a bat in her lab?
Well, we work with labs in around 40 countries around the world. We've been doing this work for 20 years, and we only work with good laboratories. Zhongli Shi is an excellent virologist. I have no reason to believe that she's not telling the truth. Everything I've heard in my 15 years of working with people in that lab has been absolutely normal and what you'd expect from virology labs. And the real kicker to all of this is that they didn't have the virus in the lab anyway. Nobody has the virus from bats that then led to COVID-19. We've not found it yet. We've found close relatives, but it's not the same virus. So to my mind, it's not a possibility.
But there is a concern that there has been some cover-up, may be too strong a word, but the Chinese government is not allowing researchers access to the lab. They have not shared information. There is now even a ban or a censoring of scientific articles coming out of China on COVID-19. What do you think is going on, and does that make you suspicious, or is it reasonable to be suspicious?
Well, I think what happened is after we found this pandemic, it became politicized. Early on, China was very open. They shared the full genome sequences of the viruses openly with the rest of the world very, very quickly, quicker than we've ever seen this before for any country, really. So openness and transparency was there early on. But I think we started to see the conspiracy theories, the pointing of the finger at China, and just this sort of politicization that means countries clamp up. And it's really unfortunate because what we need right now is open communication with scientists across the world. China's done a lot to deal with this virus before us. They know a lot about how to control it. We need access to that information, and talking in political terms about this outbreak closes down that access.
You said we may not ever know, but I want to ask you, there is one possibility, is there not, which is that this went from a bat to another species, and then from that species to a human being.
Well, we saw that with SARS. SARS went from a bat into civets and into people, and that's happened with other viruses around the world. So that is a common pathway by which they emerge. They get into another species that's farmed, for instance, where there's a lot of them, and it just amplifies the amount of virus available to infect people.
And a final question, just to explain to everybody, why bats? Explain how bats have a high immune system and they gather together. What explains why bats are the source of all these problems?
Yeah, I feel really sorry for bats because they don't exactly get a good rap in human history anyway. And here they are carrying these viruses. Well, the viruses in bats don't seem to do much damage. They're in the GI tract. Bats carry Ebola and Marburg virus, rabies and others. And usually they're pretty harmless. And what we think is that bats have an ability to carry a higher viral load, a higher amount of virus in their body, and a high diversity of viruses. And that may be related to the fact that they're the only flying mammal. And flying has such a stress on the system that their immune response would constantly be reacting to the breakdown of cellular products. So they dampen the immune system down. There's good evidence for that. And don't forget, bats are actually very common, very abundant, very diverse, about 1/5 of all mammals. And we don't see them, so we don't really appreciate how exposed we are to bats flying overhead at night, bats flying into our farms, people going into bat caves on a daily basis in these regions.
Peter, this has been so illuminating. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Fareed.